I was on the wrong stage earlier for like 15 minutes, so I was really hoping this was the right one, and it looks like it is. One second. Thank you. Oh, dear. So is it just me solo? Hey, Max. Is it? Do you want me to start or? Thank you. I wasn't sure if you were going to do. Okay. 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 Cool. All right. So just gonna remember to share my screen. Let me just pull it up here. Well, thanks for joining us. Um, second. All right. All righty. So, share. There we go. Yay. All right. So, um, now I want to share the entire thing. So, I want to share entire screen. No, window. Okay. Thank you. I don't think it sees all of my windows. So, whatever. Just roll with this. All right. So thanks for joining. Um, this is my presentation, and my name is Nia. I am the host of the Dreams of Black Wall Street podcast. And my podcast is, for those of you who came last year, you probably remember my presentation was largely about the Tulsa Race Massacre at the time. So this year, or this season rather, season 2, I'm continuing the podcast. It received a good amount of feedback, and so I decided to continue it. Originally, this was supposed to be like a 1-season podcast, but I decided to continue it and continue telling the story of little known African American communities in the beginning of, I guess, our country post slavery, during and after the Reconstruction period. And so this season, I'm focusing on a community called Rosewood, Florida. And Rosewood was sort of like a town hamlet sort of community that existed between 1844 and 1923. And so this was a very self-sufficient town. At the time of its demise, it was mostly all Black. It unfortunately became victim to a racially motivated massacre, similar to Tulsa, actually. But this story is a little bit different. And I should say that the death toll varies between like 8 and 100 people, but so far, I believe researchers have only been able to verify 8 people total who were killed. In any event, this is also a story about the long road to justice and compensation that a lot of the survivors of the Rosewood Massacre and their descendants took in order to try to not only be repaid or compensated for what was lost, but actually get the state of Florida to acknowledge that this event occurred, and it occurred largely because the government turned the other cheek. We'll talk about that a little later. And I'm going to kind of fly through these slides. So I'm not going to read everything, but I'm going to definitely go through the main points. So this was settled, Rosewood was settled in 1845 by both Black and white people, but it was very much segregated. The lumber industry, harvesting of lumber, cedar trees, turpentine, logging, a lot of that is what attracted folks to Rosewood. And then the cedar tree decimation caused a lot of the white families to move to the neighboring town of Sumner in the 1890s. So after that, Rosewood was largely a Black town. Now, it was never incorporated, so that's important to mention. What's also important to mention is that even before slavery ended in the United States, before the Emancipation Proclamation, there were free African Americans living in Rosewood, in Florida, in the Deep South. Again, before slavery ended in the entire, I guess, before the Civil War. And that was very unusual at the time. In any event, a lot of the families that migrated to Rosewood came from places such as North Carolina. They'd been entrepreneurs, and so they came with a decent amount of money and education, backgrounds in science, history, agriculture. It was very much agrarian society, so there was growing of crops and raising of livestock. A lot of people participated in trapping of animals and fish. There was a bank in Rosewood, a water tower, several churches, schools, and a Masonic lodge, and 2 general stores. And again, by the 1920s, Rosewood's population was about 200, mostly Black people, and considered pretty prosperous for the time. Now, here's just a picture of some turpentine workers in Florida. And when I say prosperous, understand that means, relatively prosperous, because again, we're talking about the early part of the 20th century here. And so what I do in this season is I really try to give people an understanding of how an event such as the Rosewood Massacre could occur. This is a week-long massacre of a community. And so what I do, similar to the last season where I studied the Tulsa Race Massacre, is I take folks back to the beginning of Florida. And I do that by, and some people may disagree, but I do that by starting prior to statehood. Now, Florida, as some of you may know, was under the rule of several different colonizers. And one of the things that's really interesting when we talk about this history, and I know a lot of you probably heard of the 1619 Project, which, by the way, I really, really love, but something that's, I guess, very common in our society is this overemphasis of the year 1619, when Africans were first brought to Jamestown, Virginia. A lot of people believe that's the beginning of slavery in what became the United States of America, but that's not true. Now, that is the first year Africans arrived in English North America, but it's not the first year that slaves arrived to what would later become the United States. That was actually 1526. It was a very short-lived, I think, 6-week settlement of Spanish settlers in which slaves rebelled, African slaves rebelled. And oh no, really? It's not taking the screen. Give me 1 second. Well, thanks for telling me. Um, because I would have just kept going for the next 30 minutes. Let's see what's going on. Now, this is not my forte. I will say this system here, but see if I can fix it. All right. So let's see if we can share the screen, and I'll try to do it. All right. I'll try to do it this way. Thanks, Max. Here we go. All right, share window. I think I might know what may have happened. How about now? Are you seeing anything else? Yeah, do you see anything else? Okay, great. So I'm just going to skip over the slides that because you got it. You got the idea, right? So we're talking about 1619. So first year that we know of that slaves came to what would become the United States is 1526. We know this because it's documented. However, a lot of this documentation is in Spanish, based on the documents that were signed at the time. And I can, if you hit me up after, I can take you kind of through the history of that. So that kind of might be why a lot of folks don't recognize 1526. However, it wasn't until 1565 that the first successful European settlement in America took shape. That is St. Augustine, Florida. Yes, there were African slaves there. St. Augustine actually initially was a place where slaves were brought. Afterwards, however, it actually became a place where there were both slaves and free Blacks. And that was because the Spanish treated slavery a bit differently than the British. And so some slaves from neighboring states like Georgia, for example, would actually flee to St. Augustine because they knew that the Spanish actually accepted free Blacks, even though simultaneously there were still slaves there. So again, don't have that much time, but hit me up after and I can explain all of this to you, or you can just listen to my podcast. In any event, St. Augustine is still in existence today. So again, not 1619, but prior to that is when we saw the first slaves arrive in America. And I mentioned this in this podcast because St. Augustine, again, is in Florida. And a lot of this history kind of shapes what Florida becomes later on. Okay, so again, still revisiting the past to understand the Rosewood Massacre. And so about 100 years or so ago, there were about 1,200 Black settlements, enclaves, towns, so on and so forth. Today, there's less than 50. And so why I'm saying that is because there was a concerted effort to not only make it very difficult for African Americans post-Civil War to have sort of full citizenship, but also it was difficult for them to have anything. And a lot of people, former slaves, Black people, African Americans, formed these communities because it was really their only choice based on discrimination, segregation, Jim Crow laws, et cetera, et cetera. So Rosewood was one of these almost safe havens where Black people could sort of, enjoy the things that American citizens were supposed to enjoy in terms of creating a livelihood for themselves, a family for themselves, practicing whatever religion they wanted, being entrepreneurs if they wanted, so on and so forth. But there were others like that as well. The Florida community of Eatonville, Florida, which still exists today. This is the hometown of Zora Neale Hurston. It boasts as the first incorporated Black community in America. There are some people who disagree, but you get the point, right? And so you also have the town of Ocoee, Florida, another prosperous Black community, enclave, safe haven, so on and so forth. But again, here's an example of why a lot of people who were perhaps white supremacists or part of the KKK did not only didn't want Black people to have the rights that, full citizens of the United States would have, they really did all they could to strip them of any sort of livelihood. So you have in Ocoee, Florida in 1920, what is known as the largest incident of voting day violence in U.S. history. This was a segregated town. About 1,000 or so were Black, and two of the most successful families were the Perrys and the Normans. Well, I can tell you that a man named Moses Norman tried to vote, along with several other Black people. That caused a backlash. And some people say that Moses Norman went to his friend July Perry's house. Well, ultimately, Moses Norman escaped after the KKK tried to lynch him for trying to vote, but they were successful in lynching July Perry and destroying his home. Some of his family members were able to get away, and then a number of homes in Ocoee were destroyed, as well as a number of other buildings. And ultimately, most Black people fled Ocoee. And the thing a lot of people don't realize when I tell the story and when they learn this history is that this actually occurred in the midst of a massive voter registration and get out the vote movement among the Black community in Florida that was actually led by some of the most prominent leaders in the Black community in Florida at the time. And Ocoee was not the only community where this voting day violence happened in 1920. Dozens of other communities experienced things of a similar nature. Ocoee, however, was probably the most extreme form. This is a picture you can see on your left of July Perry there. And so one of the things that's it's important to note is that lynching was not uncommon, obviously, during this time. You're talking about the Jim Crow South, but it was really used not only as a tool of terror, but to suppress things like the Black vote and Black people who were trying to create a livelihood for themselves, perhaps become entrepreneurs or thrive in the business community. So we have another example. A month before the Rosewood massacre happened, a community of Perry, Florida, experienced a similar attack. A white teacher named Ruby Henry was found murdered. A Black man, he was actually an ex-con, named Charles Wright, was blamed for it. He was lynched and burned at the stake. There was no evidence. Two other Black men were killed and tortured. And again, the town set ablaze. Not everything and every Black person in the town was destroyed this time, but it was almost like a foreshadowing in terms of what would to come a month later, 1923, in Rosewood, Florida. And so again, another racially motivated massacre, this time another young woman named Fannie Taylor, alleging that she'd been beaten by a Black man. And it was not uncommon for lynchings to be justified by claiming that a white woman had been assaulted by a Black man or an unknown assailant at the time, with little evidence of that. Taylor's husband gathered a posse, including hundreds of Ku Klux Klan members, and they eventually did set their sights on a house that was owned by Sarah Carrier. It's a picture of her, the matriarch of the Carrier family. And they thought that whoever did this to Fannie Taylor was being hidden by the Black people here in Rosewood. A number of folks were attacked and lynched. There was a gunfight that broke out at the Carrier's house when some of the Klan members approached it. Also, not only just Klan members, but members of law enforcement as well in neighboring Sumner, which was the white community. And ultimately, I should say, Aaron Carrier, who was the son of Sarah Carrier, he was known as a great marksman, a great shooter. And so he defended the home for as long as he could. Ultimately, most of the children and people inside of the Carrier home escaped to the swamps in the woods behind the home. Other people in Rosewood also managed to escape into the swamps, and hundreds of Ku Klux Klan members spent basically a week terrorizing the town until there was essentially nothing left, because a woman claimed that she was raped by a Black man. Now, as the legend goes, I say legend because this is what is passed down over the years, it is said that Fannie Taylor was actually involved with a man who was not her husband, but that she made up this lie because her and that man got into a physical altercation and she needed some way to explain the bruises to her husband. I actually interviewed Fannie Taylor's descendant, and you can listen to my podcast and you can hear that episode. It's quite fascinating, and it just gives you an idea of how history is really interpreted differently on different sides. And so this is a picture of the New York Times. When the news of the Rosewood massacre started to spread across the country, it was national news at the time. Another picture there. It's important to mention Governor Kerry Hardy. He knew that this was happening. He asked the local sheriff, "Do you need me to send reinforcements, the National Guard, anything, anyone?" Local sheriff said no. And so Governor Hardy allegedly went hunting. In the meantime, Rosewood burned to the ground. And it wasn't uncommon for a lot of members of local law enforcement to be part of the Ku Klux Klan as well. So there's a picture of Governor Hardy there. And, a little backstory here. I won't get into the minutia of all of this, but it's just important to note that now, while this was national news at the time, eventually this sort of faded into the background. A lot of the Black people who escaped Rosewood did so in nearby towns and communities. Well, they actually lived next door to some of the people who did the massacring, who actually killed some of their family members or friends and burned their homes down. And so they did not want them to know who they were, so they kept it a secret. This was a self-imposed silence for many, many decades. And I can tell you that it was difficult for a lot of these people to live in these communities. The Florida State University history professor, Dr. Maxine Jones, I interviewed her about this. And, as she mentioned, a lot of folks were just really worried that people would find out who they were and try to finish the job. So the story remained buried until a newspaper article was published in 1982, and subsequently 60 Minutes did a story about it in 1983. And this led to national coverage of the Rosewood Massacre, and many of the survivors, now elderly people, coming forward to tell their story of what had happened. Dr. Maxine Jones was part of an academic team who did research and verified that this did indeed happen. And a lawsuit was brought by some of the survivors of the Rosewood Massacre and their descendants. A man named Stephen Hanlon, he's a wonderful civil rights attorney. He worked with his colleague Martha Barnett. They both worked at a law firm in Florida called Holland and Knight. And Stephen Hanlon, actually, he started their pro bono unit. It's one of the top law firms in the nation. And it was largely because of their efforts that not only did they bring a lawsuit against the state of Florida, but they won. And this is, again, Florida we're talking about. So this is not easy, but these are very, very skilled attorneys. Now, a bill awarding the Rosewood family members $2 million, as well as an educational fund for the descendants, was the outcome. And yes, it's not a very large amount of money, but as far as most historians know, this massacre of Rosewood and the subsequent compensation of the victims and their descendants is the only case of its kind, some might call it reparations, here in the United States as a result of some action that was taken against a governmental body. Reparations is a very loaded word. So Hanlon, actually, when I interviewed him, he mentioned he had to call it compensation just to get it passed. But yes, he admits it was reparations. This is a very blurry photo of the signing of the bill. It was called House Bill 591. And there's Martha Barnett and Stephen Hanlon in the background there. And so that is a very, very, very brief overview of this season of the Dreams of Black Wall Street podcast, which, again, I host and produce and write and edit and all that stuff. So, Max, if you want to jump in here, if we have any questions, I'm happy to start answering some. I'm trying to be cognizant of the time. Good question. So, I don't know which community you're talking about, but there were some communities, some all Black communities that were successful during this part of the century. One was Eatonville, Florida. And so when lynching was so prevalent, I mean, actually, Black men, I should say Florida had the highest number of lynchings per capita in the country at this time. So one might ask, how does a Black community like this survive in this climate? Well, Eatonville, Florida is actually sort of like far away from a lot of other communities. And they were, as opposed to Rosewood and perhaps Ocoee, which were more segregated. You had Rosewood and Sumner, Eatonville was all Black. So they were away and out of the sight of a lot of KKK members and other communities. In addition, Eatonville was founded because a white man decided to sell his land to some Black entrepreneurs in order to allow them to start their own community, which was uncommon at the time because a lot of white people would not sell land to Black people at all. So yes, there were some communities, and it happened in other places of the country, but for our purposes in Florida, that were successful and figured out ways to work around a system that was really set up for them to fail. Good question. So they were, like I mentioned, there were about 1,200 or so all Black town, cities, enclaves in the beginning of the 20th century, over 100 years ago or so. Today, there are less than 50. Many of them were either destroyed by what we now know as race massacres, what used to be called race riots, but these were generally massacres. Or what would happen is something called white capping, where perhaps somebody in a neighboring white community or in the same community would come to, the area where Black families lived and say, hey, I want your land. I see you're doing well. I see you're making a lot of money. I want your land. I want your house. And if you don't give it to me, I'm going to kill you. And so you have to leave. And this happened in dozens upon dozens of communities across the United States, as well as in Florida. And then there's also what we call urban renewal, which is supposed to be a way to, revitalize a community, but often the policies are quite harmful for those who are marginalized in that community. So you have redlining and, all these other policies, or do yourself a little bit of homework and find all Black communities in which a highway runs right through them, essentially decimating, the property value, and destroying really a lot of the community attributes, that made it a desirable place to live. And so there are, again, today, less than 50 of these all Black cities and towns left here in America. And to give you some perspective, in Oklahoma, in 1921, there were 50 all Black towns and communities in Oklahoma alone. And now, today, not very many at all. Yes. So what I would suggest is I've interviewed a ton of people. So I would suggest one, there is a journalist called Cameron McWhirter. He wrote a book about a lot of the race riots or massacres that occurred during this period in our country. He is a journalist for the Wall Street Journal, but he also is a foreign correspondent. So he's actually reported in conflict zones previously. So he knows a lot about how this works, on a domestic level and on a global level. And if you read his book, The Red Summer, he kind of highlights the Red Summer of 1919, where there were about 25 or so race massacres in 25 different all Black communities in the United States in just 1919 alone. And so that'll give you a good idea as well. Blood in the Water is another book that's really good. I cannot remember the name of the author. I'll get it for you if you email me. But Blood in the Water is good because it actually talks about this phenomena of white capping and how, for example, in the early part of the 20th century, you had thousands of Black farmers across the United States. And now we have less than 1% of the farmers in the US are Black today. About 14% were Black back then. And this is largely because their land was either taken from them through the process of white capping or deceptive, tax policies and practices. So that's another good one to read. If not, I skipped over a lot of really important things, but I think, what I wanted to kind of emphasize this season, and I have one one episode left to produce, is that I know that these stories are quite tragic, right? But really what I wanted people to get from this season and, this story about Rosewood is that there was perseverance, there was tenacity. These were a proud people. They were very spiritual people. They, were able to escape. And at the time in their minds, it was a shameful thing. They didn't want people to know they had to hide in the swamp for several days, in their pajamas if they were lucky, and, escape on a train that, a nice gentleman, a white man named John Wright, was able to organize for them to leave and escape from Rosewood. But to me, that's a testament of strength, right? And also, there's always people in these stories who do good. And maybe they were not the majority at the time, right? But I always want to emphasize that shared human connection, because in every story like this that I've come across, there is always somebody who tries to do the right thing or tries to help. And I don't want to paint the picture that, it was just white and Black and nothing in between, because that's not the case. It just is what it is because of the time period we were in. But John Wright, for example, he owned the general store in Rosewood. And he, again, was the gentleman who allowed a lot of the survivors in Rosewood to hide on his property while members of the KKK were coming for them, literally just hunting people. And he could have been killed. And in fact, John Wright, he actually, interestingly enough, when all of the survivors left Rosewood after that horrible week, a lot of them were so wealthy, they had paid their taxes for their land years in advance, but they could not go back and claim their land because they would be killed. So once it came time to pay their taxes again several years later, a lot of people claimed their land, and again, deceptive tax policies and practices. But records show that a lot of the land that belonged to the Black residents of Rosewood ended up, their deeds, in the hands of John Wright. So some people speculate and wondered maybe he bought it so that, he could sell it back to them at some point, hoping to try to do something good in this unfortunate situation. And unfortunately, John Wright, it seemed like that traumatized him probably just as much as it traumatized a lot of the survivors. I know his wife died. He used to sit every night in his living room, I'm told, with a gun, because he was so afraid that the KKK were going to come for him, and they did threaten him. But he was so afraid that they would make attempts on his life. And, he died, I believe, of alcoholism, or after, having a very heavy drinking problem. So it just shows you how pervasive that trauma, is, not only for the people who were targeted, but even for the people who tried to help them. Yeah, it's a good question. So, if we're talking about Rosewood, Florida specifically, a lot of the descendants, so cute. It's okay. I have a cat too. I'm just so glad he didn't jump in my screen. A lot of the descendants, as I mentioned, they spread out. Some went to Miami, Gainesville, a place called Lacucci, Florida. And if I have time, here's an amazing story that is on the most recent episode of my podcast that I love. So I mentioned that there was a Rosewood claims bill that was put through, that was filed on behalf of the descendants and awarded to the survivors and descendants of the Rosewood massacre. Well, one of the attorneys, as I mentioned earlier, on that case was a lead attorney named Martha Barnett. At the time, she was the first woman to be hired by Holland and Knight. At the time, one of Tampa's top law firms, and now today, one of the top law firms in the country. And so she was an amazing lobbyist, and she would spend 20 something hours a day, trying to get members of the legislature in Florida to, vote for this bill. So this didn't just happen, right? Well, after Martha joined the case in a very serendipitous way, because Stephen Hanlon asked her to, well, she realized that she actually grew up with a lot of the Rosewood survivors. She lived in a town called Lacucci, Florida. And Lacucci, Florida is not terribly far from Rosewood. And a lot of the survivors from Rosewood fled to Lacucci because there was a sawmill there. And Martha's father was the doctor for the mill. And so he not only treated a lot of the survivors, he delivered their babies. And so his name is actually also on a lot of their death certificates. Except at the time, Martha's dad and mom never told her about the Rosewood massacre. Later on, when she realized that she grew up with a lot of them, she asked some of the survivors, do you think my parents knew, my mom and dad? And they said, oh, absolutely they knew, but they never told Martha. In fact, so Arnett Doctor is the Black man who is a descendant of a woman named Philomena Goines, who was a survivor of the Rosewood massacre. She was 3 years old when she escaped. Arnett Doctor, after Philomena Goines, his mother, died, he was the one who spearheaded this lawsuit to get compensation for the survivors and their descendants. Well, he grew up with Martha in Lacucci, Florida. So when Stephen Hanlon asked Martha to join the case, he said, Martha, you know a guy named Arnett Doctor? She went, of course I know Arnett Doctor. So Stephen Hanlon didn't believe her. So he called Arnett. You know a woman named Martha Barnett? And she said, no. But her name was Martha. She had a different last name. So when he said her last name, Arnett Doctor said, oh, that's baby Martha. Of course I know baby Martha, And so I know this sounds very serendipitous, but maybe it's fate. Who knows? But if it wasn't for that personal connection, right, that Martha had with Arnett Doctor and all these survivors, it's unclear what would have happened. And again, that's an example of how spread out the survivors were. That some of them, went to Lakuchi, Florida, the place where one of the top attorneys in the nation would then help them get compensation for this massacre. Martha eventually became the president of the American Bar Association, by the way. She's retired now. But when I say she's a top attorney, she's like real deal. Oh, and Martha was white, by the way, I should say. I don't know if I mentioned that, but Martha was a white woman. So probably important to mention. But and what's also interesting is you don't see a lot of friendships between white and black people, especially survivors. Martha's mother and Philomena Goins, a black woman, were actually friends during that time. And so it's really interesting that Martha's mom knew, because Philomena wanted to take that knowledge to her grave. She did not want her son Arnett Doctor to file a lawsuit or publicize this in any way. She was afraid of what would happen. Yeah. Mhm. Oh my gosh, yes. And I again, I had to, skip over a lot of stuff for the interest of time, but absolutely. And I will say that that first settlement, when I talked about how 1619 was not the year that slaves first came to what we know today as the United States. See, a lot of people like to parse words, and they will say, okay, English North America. Listen, it's the United States. No, I have nothing against the journalists at the 1619 Project. I listen to the podcast, I love it myself. But you know, these things matter, right? So in 1526, that Spanish settlement of several dozen African slaves who eventually rebelled after several weeks, they fled to the Native American community. And a lot of scholars believe that is how they survived. In 1565, there was a lot when St. Augustine, was, I guess, founded or so. There were, again, a lot of interaction between Native Americans and the Spanish colonizers at the time, and black people. Not only that, a lot of black people who were escaping slavery from, for example, Georgia, coming over to Florida, would do so and join a lot of the Native American communities at the time. Now, it's important to recognize, at some point there was a Trail of Tears, and these Native Americans often were forced from their land. There was also the Spanish American, the wars that some Native American tribes fought against the British. But some black people actually fought with Native Americans to keep the British away, because it was in their self-interest. Both the black people wanted to stay free, and they knew they could find free havens in Florida, but also Native Americans wanted to keep their land. Okay, and so there was a lot of interaction between Native Americans and black people, and also other Europeans. And this, I'm glad, I appreciate that question, because this is something that I do cover in the podcast that I didn't get to talk about a lot today. And thanks for moderating, Max. And thanks for telling me I was messing up that screen share. Yeah. Yes, it is fascinating. Yeah. So that is why I do this work. I want everybody to know about it. I want to make Black history like mainstream history. Yeah. And I don't know, I can go into like a meeting room or something if folks want to ask me questions afterwards. I don't know how to, if you want me to, if you pick a room for me, Max, and then I just go in or whatever. Um, okay. Mhm. Well, let's do the meeting room. Do you know which meeting room I would be in? Because I know if I go to the meeting, it'll jump me out of. All right, so I'm going to head over to stage 3 in the meeting room. So if anybody has any other questions, I'll be there for a little bit and I can answer them there. Thanks for joining.